So again, thank you all for the time today. I'm just going to take a brief moment and talk about what we're seeing in Microsoft, what we're seeing with our clients, and just what's changed in the world today. There's definitely, and obviously everybody is seeing this in today's world with everything that's going on. Uh, the work environment's changed, and it likely will never go back to normal. It's never going to be the way it was. Um, as we see it in Microsoft, what's changed or what's happened in the last 2 years is really um, changed in the last 2 months more than it's ever done in the last two previous years. And what we're also seeing is because people need to change the way they work, you don't have the luxury of always going to the office and keeping everything within your four walls when it comes to your content, your people, your processes, and people are now working from their home offices. Is that remote work has introduced and heightened a new concern for where my content is and how people can get it out. Good example is Microsoft. We have this time of year. There's a ton of events that we usually do in person, which involve a lot of NDA content that us as Microsoft employees learn about. And it's always been an ask of us is please do not take this content out of the room. But when we change our entire ecosystem to all of us now virtually attending, that's a hard thing to ask of people, and also it's a hard thing to govern from a data loss perspective and a privacy perspective and things of that nature. The other thing that we're seeing is regulatory concerns and just the amount of regulatory bodies that are coming in and or changing regulations. There's literally I'd say just in the last month related to the 900 plus regulations that are out in there, 37 have had amendments just in the last week alone. And keeping up with those and ensuring that your audit controls and how you do things in the past. One of the major roles that I do in Microsoft is with any clients in Canada that makes a decision to go to the cloud, you're usually talking with me to go through the audit controls to ensure that you comply and you understand what it means when there's that shared relationship between a controller and a processor. And then finally, you'd have to be living under a rock and or not see what's going on in the world with cyber attacks and insider threat, with people working from home and the way people have gotten around the holes of maybe going around a VPN as opposed to going through a VPN or split tunneling or all that. There's a lot of things that organizations, in order for people to continue to do things that they needed to do, they've compromised their security or risk posture to do so. And that includes even their Canadian federal government and the way when we ensure or instill the Emergency Measures Act, there's certain things that we don't have to do as organizations that we normally would have had to do in the past. But obviously, all of this really does introduce a ton of concerns. And some of those concerns that we're seeing is now that this has happened, and even before, is that employees are saying almost half that they kind of like the way it's going, and I don't necessarily need to be in an office every day. And if I had the opportunity, I would take the advantage of a work from home policy as much as I could and things of that nature. The only problem with that is also almost all organizations are saying that they do keep information in the cloud. And that statement's kind of an interesting one because I do hear a lot that we can use cloud, but we can't store any personally identifiable information based upon regulatory requirements, which is other than some regulations, most organizations today, that's actually quite a false statement. But there's still that concern of, I don't want people snooping around on my content. When I go to the cloud, I don't have the controls that I had in place when it came to an on-premises where I controlled the four walls. I was the administrator. There wasn't a subset of individuals managing a data center abroad that I don't know who they are. I don't know what they do. I don't know their credentials. The problem with that is at the same time, almost 90% of these same organizations are saying they just don't have the confidence to know and detect where this information lies. So it's kind of a conflicting statement when we hear we can't put any information in the cloud, and then in return is, well, we don't know if people are putting it in the cloud, or we don't know where they're putting it. We don't know the applications they're using. And then another big stat, and I would say this is probably upwards of about 67% now since work from home, is that more than 2/3 of all content that has been accidentally lost and omitted or known in organizations, the backlog of it when they do the investigations, almost 60% of it is actually just people doing it unintentionally, not knowing that they weren't supposed to do something, or not knowing that in a 100-page document or a long-winded email that they might be forwarding, um, unbeknownst to them, on page 3 or way down in it actually had somebody that accidentally or intentionally wrote a credit card number, social insurance number, or something that would be deemed as personally identifiable in any organization. So accidental or unintentional data loss is becoming the bigger concern than the actual data loss where we're getting outsider players trying to get to our information. Just as risky as the people within our organizations doing bad things, just simply because the amount of tools that we have, the amount of content that everybody's created, as well as in a time where we just don't have any more boundaries. Content can travel literally anywhere. It could be in 10 seconds. It could have traveled to 32 different geographical locations just simply because of where it was distributed. It could be in many different tools, and so the content of the one version of truth doesn't even apply in the world where it could be on mobile devices. It can be in somebody's personal device as well as their business device when they try and separate that church and state world. And all the cloud applications that non-IT and the shadow IT world has introduced, it's not anything new. It's just growing, and applications are growing at an astronomical case. And there's so many great things that people are building today that for point solutions, that's very easy to say, I need to do this for this purpose. And there's a tool or an app or a website that does exactly what I need. I'll just throw in a credit card and spin up that app and give it to my 5 members of the team because it does exactly what we need. And we can't do the wait traditionally for IT to put it in a backlog of projects to give us something. So ultimately, how we would say, and what we would look at as data loss is really the first step is you got to know where your content is. You got to know who the people are that touch the content, and you have to know the places in the landscape, your own landscape. And there's so many different avenues to what that landscape means compared to the olden ways. Then it's really determining how you want to govern it, how you want to classify that information. Not everything is sensitive. You don't want to turn on a policy and say, we want to have data loss policies across all of our content, all of our streams, and put on, and I've heard organizations do this, and with mixed results, is saying we're going to classify everything as highly confidential, using that proactive approach, and ask of the individuals to make a determination that it's not. So there's really, it's a fine balance of using the proper processes and understanding your users' work. It's understanding what you want to get out of it from a security perspective. You don't want to compromise your compliance aspects, things like e-discovery, where I've seen organizations say, well, we're going to classify everything as highly confidential, or any personally identifiable information is further encrypted using double encryption keys. Problem with doing that is you extract that content and put it into some form of forensics tool. Well, it's all encrypted, and now you're breaking your compliance regulations because your legal teams can't do what they need to do. So there's always that compromise, and you have to ensure that you have that balance between those three. And then finally, being able to continuously improve. Something that I see far too often overlooked is, over time, your data loss strategy and data loss prevention and information protection strategy, it can't be a one-size-fits-all, and it can't be a point in time, turn it on and hope for the best. It's going to be an iterative process that you're continuously going to. When we talk about the know your data, few questions that I always ask of clients, and clients ask of me, is just, what are some methods that you do use today to classify your data? For some, it's highly evolved. I usually find in regulated organizations this is not a new practice, whereas in some small and medium businesses where it's not any greater or less of a concern, they just don't have the budget, time, or people to potentially think about this problem on a continuous basis. Also, the ability to how and where I can classify my data and enforce these policies. There's certain tools out there. There's certain applications that just don't support. They maybe don't have a back-end system of a robust set of APIs that you can call and go into the tools to apply it. Not as much anymore, but we still see the legacy applications where it is trouble to try and figure out because you can't scan it or so forth. And then also, like, how can I see what happens to my data? Just to go from a Microsoft lens, I did want to show, it wouldn't be proper to do some form of demonstrations, but as a general best practice in Microsoft 365, one of the first things that you'll want to do is, I see far too often, is you want to have a dedicated team that their purpose is and/or one of their several purposes is data loss prevention. What I generally find and say as a best practice is, don't make people that are security and give everybody that has to have some form of elevated privilege just the common global administrative role. In Office 365, we do have some dedicated roles that you can say for people that you want to be able to create data loss prevention policies, or view data loss prevention policies. There's a role called the data prevention manager or classification manager. And here are some of the roles that I would say I recommend to give those individuals. And if they need to be and do other security things inside Office 365, you can obviously give them more permissions. But this would be the bare bones permission, even right down to if you wanted them to only be read only. So maybe senior leadership, you want to give them the ability to see how it's performing, but you don't necessarily want to give them the keys to the kingdom to create policies. But what I always say is role specific, very targeted privileged access, and use that global administrator or security administrator or compliance administrator role very sparingly, because obviously one of the target areas as a former security ethical hacker myself is doing brute force attacks and looking for those accounts that are the global administrator or the administrator to the keys to the kingdom. Those are the ones that I really want to find, because they have the keys to so many things that's going to give me, as an outside threat, the ability to do very significant damage, as opposed to attacking people that have zero trust. From a classification perspective, we have a tool, a bunch of different tools that you can use. The latest is what's called data classification, where it's a centralized approach to data loss prevention. So we're really expanding on how we think of data loss prevention as not being just it's to prevent something from happening, but also being reactive, that if something bad does happen, still having the ability, because it's attached to the content, to revoke access even after it's left your four walls, using things called data classification policies or information protection policies. So it's really about preventing and protecting in the case of. This is just an example of how I can create a policy. So first and foremost, do I want to use some of the out-of-the-box templates? I usually, as a recommendation, is evaluate the out-of-the-box templates, understand how they work behind the scenes, and usually and extract the XML and modify them slightly to meet your exact needs. Obviously, out of the box means you don't have control. So I usually say it's a fine balance of using the out of the box and test the false and positive result set, and then customize from there. You do have the ability to create your own policies and put them into the service. Next is, how do you want to apply them? In a lot of cases, maybe you want a data loss prevention policy that's going to say, I just want to apply it no matter where this content's going to reside, whether it's chat and Teams, or it's on in a Windows machine, like somebody's trying to store locally, which we kind of try and discourage people from doing that in today's world as well, but you don't always have that luxury of controlling that in some cases. OneDrive accounts, SharePoint, and obviously mail being a big one. So choosing where you want to apply, and you can choose who you want to apply it to, because one size does not fit all users as well. In a lot of organizations of regulatory nature, like FinServ or healthcare or government, there's obviously people that are regulated users and non-regulated users, and usually want to treat these types of activities by even least distinguishing that. Then saying what you want to happen when the content is detected. Do you want it encrypted? Do you not want it encrypted, and so forth. Once you create the rule and things like do not distribute, do you want it marked on the content that if they were to push, at least, we don't want people printing off paper in today's world, but people do. If they do, at least having a watermark on it that is very clearly visible that it is do not distribute or highly confidential, and then set your thresholds on how you want it identified. Once you create your policies and you determine how you want to do it, usually I recommend writing down in a team, using some digital tool or even on paper, how you want and what you think of your policies should be, and how you might have policies already in place, how they're going to translate in the cloud world, and the places that you want to apply it. Then start using the technology. It's really about pre-planning before, I would say, any technology comes into play. Mistake that I generally see is not having a plan before the technology comes in and trying to fit the strategy and the technology, which I would say is generally led to support calls or a back date and say, okay, we did it wrong, we have to go backwards. So I would say to save time and costs and resources, plan it out before you start thinking of what the tools can do. The tools will fit no matter whether it's Microsoft or other. You'll be able to fit your strategy in one way or another. It's really, don't compromise your strategy to technology, and never let technology compromise your strategy. From a protection perspective, on a I'm just going to show it from a Microsoft perspective. So obviously, Word, Office tools. In any case, you can do it in two fashions. You can use machine learning and artificial intelligence, that if it's detected, you can make recommendations, or you can be enforceable and say, because this contains a social insurance number, this is going to be classified as X. Or you can do what I usually recommend is a lighter, more carrot approach, which is, by the way, this contains some information that we have deemed as sensitive to your organization. Apply the sensitivity. Same with the cloud. So one thing that, for those that might have invested in Office 365 for some time, some good news out there is that this whole process and data loss prevention is now available in the cloud version of Office, so Word and so forth, where you can apply, as you can see in the top right, sensitivity labels to all in Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. Excel generally I find is the #1 culprit, with Word being #2, and that's what we see. Another thing as well is being able to push these policies down to the mobile device, both Android and iOS, which is great, being that those are really the majority of choices that your organizations usually have. There's a pocket of BlackBerry. If you have BlackBerry, I apologize right now. It's to come, but no time frame on that. But at least iOS and Android, you can absolutely apply it to a message, that if it's detected in a message, you can see here that I can do it in one fashion, is being proactive and saying, because this piece of email that you sent contains personally identifiable information, you're not going to be able to send it out, or you're going to have to find a different means. Or in this case, I want to provide the labels to them that the end user themselves can make that decision. It's really a decision on every organization and how you want to apply it. And then more recently, as well as with Teams, we've had this request from the day we released Teams, is can we apply data loss prevention to things like chat and communication? And the answer is you can absolutely do that today. You can create the same policy that you would have that functions like email, but in this case, as you can see here, if I do a chat that contains, say, a credit card number, before it reaches that individual, or in near real time of when it reaches, it catches it, scans it, and then blocks it from that person receiving it, anybody that's on that chat from the future. But as an end user, I have a very clear and concise message to me that I did something wrong that wasn't allowed in the organization. And it's not intrusive because the other individuals aren't aware that I even did it. So it's not intrusive to the individual that they feel like they're being judged by their peers because they did something bad. And then finally, another tool that I'm seeing, whether it's Microsoft Cloud App Security or other cloud app security brokerage services, Don't leave home without it. If you don't have one in your organization, I highly suggest investing at looking at a cloud application security brokerage service. This is one of the greatest tools for you to uncover two really important things: is what are the applications my organizations are using, and then number two, what is the data that's residing in each one of these applications. And in the cases of, I can see here, detecting in not just Microsoft technologies, but any of these cloud technologies. And that's what a cloud app security brokerage service is really, is what are the applications and what's going on in the content and who's doing it. So highly recommend that. From a behind the scenes perspective, what's really happening, I'm going to use email. So as I compose an email, first thing that the system's doing behind the scenes is getting the content. So it's always indexing, it's always searching for end user purpose of being able to search content, and then from a security perspective, using the security graph behind the scene. Next, it takes that, gets that content. So as you can see here, it recognizes a pattern. Because of that, and it meets, so this is a regex pattern, not a textually based, so it basically doesn't detect it just by XXX-SXX. It is literally doing a regex pattern detection. And once it does a checksum. Does this match or this doesn't match? In this case, it is a match. And it's also looking for near terms in this case. Near term importance to this one is obviously Visa. And because it has Visa, potentially an expiration date, and a credit card number, that really looks to me, as well as the system, as a positive hit on the count and confidence. When this happens from an end user perspective, it's returned to the DLP rules agent. So it's logged, it's captured in the audit log for administrators to do forensics later to see what's happened in the past and the attempts. So the great news is you can also see the effectiveness of your DLP strategy by going in a backward state. And if you need to, you can extract that content for further analytics into, say, a SIEM like Splunk or Azure Sentinel is a good example. What really happens behind the scenes is the eventual verdicts from an end user perspective. So down here, I have a bunch of credit cards and other things. As you can see, the policy tip showed here, and this is the reason why it did that from a checksum. You can ingest your own regex commands as well. So that's something that we've recently released. It's been a request. Another one for things like Sec 17A4 is you can also ingest now large dictionary files of things that you might want to do under regulatory compliance of those regulated users and monitor not just patterns, but also keywords that they might be saying, like fraud or the apples, or buy the apples and not the oranges, and start using artificial intelligence to recognize not just real terms or exact matches, but also slight matches and make from a compliance perspective. Then finally, before I hand it over to the next speaker, just from a monitoring perspective, few things that you could take advantage of and should is always having a clear picture as to invisibility. In this case, is called the Content Explorer. So always having the ability to, by policy, to see all of the content that's captured, right down to being able to view the content as long as you have privileged access to do so. Obviously, you're not going to have privileged access if you're not giving that permission, but always having a visibility into what is all of the content across my estate that falls into the category of PIPEDA regulation or PII, as an example. So it's just an example of this where quickly went into the Content Explorer, said just show me everything that's confidential, and I can scroll through here. It tells me exactly why it was deemed confidential and what it contains, as well as who was the author that originated this content or the person that tried to do what they were trying to do. So always having the very important things, the what is it, the why it was, and the who that and who or parties of who that did it, and being able to drill down to seeing exactly why to help accommodate when your cases of false positives. And then from an auditing perspective, there's the Activity Explorer, which gives you a real detailed view into the what went on. In this example that I'm showing here, I had DLP applied to my endpoints across my organization. What it's telling me here is my number one, and this is a big culprit in data loss, usually intentional, is the copy to USB. Even that is a signal itself that I can say, because I pushed my DLP policy to endpoint, that if somebody were to have copied content or moved content to a USB, one is encrypt it before they do that, and using many different encryption tools of your choice, and or not allowing them to do that whatsoever, essentially blocking them from that ability and telling them they can't do that. So from this view, even right down to what file types, and so I generally find there's specific file types that are usual suspects, just usually, and you might see the same. There's usually, from a usual suspects on a people and places thing, there's what we call the prime suspects or the usual suspects in our organization. So we have 173,000 plus full-time employees, but the ones that we generally see from a data loss, they're usually the ones that do a lot of data handling and deal with a lot of privacy aspects. Not that they're doing these bad things, it's just it's more the unintentional and protecting them from themselves, really, is what we're seeing. To just close off, from a best practices, I'm going to share quick. I always recommend the crawl, walk, run in everything I do. I never jump into, especially when it comes to security, is understand it and start your journey smart. When a crawl phase, this is after you've really gone through the planning, but once you've planned, some things I would recommend is discovery. Just run it in a discovery mode. So create some policies, run it against on-premises file shares, and just see what you have. Turn on a cloud app security tool and say run it and ingest your firewall log and see what tools people are using. So just knowing what's going on in your environment is a major quick win. Once you do that, then you start knowing what you can do and going forward that's going to now protect the content and govern that content. But there's zero to little and no impact to the end users because you're really running it in a discovery phase. Next is from a walk perspective, is you start throwing in the protection stuff around it. So in the stuff that in your discovery phase that you've seen happen in quite frequently, maybe it's time to throw some encryption around that, saying, because this is highly confidential information, we should really further protect this, not from just our own internal employees, but from external threat as well. And then start using the terms what referred to as labels and pushing them down to end users and doing end user education on what this really means to you as your organization when they start seeing these little bars when they're creating a new Word document or an Adobe PDF document. They start seeing these terms, explicitly understanding what they mean to them and why you're doing it on their behalf and why they're helping them being more productive as well as being more secure. Then finally, from a run perspective, this is really about just expanding in your continuous journey with DLP, running against the entire estate, maybe integrating with the many tools you might be using, looking at the places where there's gaps and filling those gaps with other technologies in that case, or filling the gaps with Microsoft. It doesn't matter. But essentially getting to the state where you start evaluating, are we going to use our own encryption keys for sensitive material for regulatory or other reasons? Are we going to not allow specific things to occur in certain tools because of the lack of DLP capabilities and maybe some of those tools? So really getting to a state, but what I would say is it's never a completion state. It's a continuous journey. There's many here, the panelists here have lived through these journeys. We've talked in the past on what, and we have a great partner here that's definitely willing to help wherever you might want some help with getting started, if you will. With that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to end the session. I'm going to stay here as part of the panelists to help answer some questions you have at the end of this. Thank you.